The woman standing in Santiago Ramon's study had already been living in his house for 3 weeks. She had sat across from him at dinner and smiled like she had known him her entire life. She had cried in his arms at 2 a.m. over a grief she couldn't name but couldn't stop feeling. And once, only once, she had kissed him in the rain, like she was choosing him, like she had always been choosing him. There was only one problem. She had just remembered her name. And it was the same name, printed on the wedding invitation Santiago Ramon had thrown into the fireplace the night she disappeared. Because the woman now living under his roof, sleeping in his guest room, reading books from his library, laughing in his orchard, was the bride who had run away from him. To understand how the man she once fled from became the only person in the world she trusted, you have to go back to the night she woke up in a stranger's house, in a stranger's bed, wearing a torn silk dress she did not recognize, with absolutely no memory of who she was. The wedding had been planned for 14 months, every detail chosen with precision. Ivory roses, a string quartet, a guest list of 212 people who had all been given printed programs with gold lettering and cloth napkins folded into the shape of swans. She had stood at the top of the stairs of Whitmore Hall and looked down at all of it. The candles, the guests in their fine clothes, the towering arrangements of flowers, and felt absolutely nothing except a slow, spreading panic. Her name was Jianna Ross. She was 26 years old. She had soft brown hair that her mother had spent an hour arranging into something elegant. She was wearing a gown that had cost more than most people earned in 3 months. And she was terrified. Not of marriage, exactly. Of this marriage. Her father had arranged everything. Not in the dramatic Victorian sense of the word. Nobody had forced her to sign anything. Nobody had threatened her. But her father, Gerald Ross, had a particular talent for making things feel inevitable. He had a way of talking about the future as though it were already settled, as though the decisions had already been made in some earlier conversation she hadn't been invited to. And the groom, Santiago Ramon, had done nothing to make her feel otherwise. Santiago Ramon was 32. He ran the Ramon Group, a sprawling network of property development firms that controlled a significant portion of the countryside estates in the southern counties. He was precise, controlled, and almost pathologically composed. He spoke at business dinners with the confidence of a man who had rehearsed his own opinions. He sent flowers on the correct dates. He greeted her father with a firm handshake and a tone that suggested mutual respect between two people managing an investment. He had never once looked at Jianna like she was anything more than the final piece of a transaction. Or at least, that was what she believed. That night, standing at the top of the stairs, she heard the string quartet begin the processional and felt the panic rise up her throat like cold water. I cannot do this. She said it out loud, quietly, to no one. Then she turned around. She walked through the back of the hall, through the kitchen where 2 caterers looked up in surprise, and out through a side door into the dark. The rain had just started. She ran across the gravel in heeled shoes that were not made for running, through the edge of the garden, and past the stone wall that bordered the property. She kept going. Down the slope, across the field, toward the country road that ran along the edge of the estate. She had no plan, no bag, no phone, no coat. Just the white silk dress and the dark rain and the distant lights of cars. She slowed to a walk when she reached the road, breathing hard, shivering, her shoes now destroyed and her dress soaked through. She told herself she would figure it out. She told herself it would all make sense once she was somewhere else, once she had space to think. But Jianna Ross never made it farther than that lonely road. Because the next thing she saw, cutting through the dark and the rain like a pair of bright, terrible eyes, were headlights. What happened next changed everything she thought she knew about the man she had just fled from. Santiago Ramon had left his own wedding reception 11 minutes after the bride disappeared. He had not caused a scene. That was not his way. When the whispers started rippling through the guests, and her father appeared at his elbow with an expression that combined fury and humiliation in equal measure, Santiago had simply said, "Give me a moment," set down his glass, and walked outside. He needed air. He needed to understand why his chest felt like something had cracked open in it, which was strange because he had spent the past 14 months telling himself that this marriage was a practical matter, a sound decision, a merger of two families who would benefit from the association. He had told himself all of that very convincingly. He had not told himself what to do if she ran. He got in his car. He drove. He had no destination in mind. He took the road out of the estate, the long, curved country lane that ran south through empty fields, and drove too fast through the rain because he did not particularly care at that moment about the speed. He came around a bend in the road, and the headlights caught something white in the rain. For a single, fractured second, his mind could not process what he was seeing. Then the image resolved. A woman, in a wedding dress, walking along the edge of the road. He hit the brakes. The car skidded on the wet surface, a long, terrible slide that lasted perhaps 2 seconds and felt like 20. The front of the car caught the edge of the road's gravel shoulder, and the impact threw the woman sideways. She went down hard. Santiago was out of the car before it had fully stopped moving. He ran to her in the rain, his dress shoes soaking through immediately, and dropped to his knees beside her. She was on the ground, unconscious, her white dress stained with mud at the hem, her head resting against her arm at an angle that told him she had hit the gravel when she fell. He recognized her instantly. Of course he did. He sat with her for a moment in the rain, in the dark, with his hands on her face, checking for breathing, for response, for any sign that she was seriously hurt. She was breathing. Her pulse was steady. But she would not wake up. He made a decision that he would later find very difficult to explain to anyone, including himself. He did not call the police. Not yet. He told himself it was practical. He told himself a country road in the rain was not the right place to wait for an ambulance. He told himself the nearest hospital was 40 minutes out and his house was 5. He told himself a lot of things. He lifted her carefully, carried her to the car, and drove her home. He called his doctor, a discreet man named Nolan who had served the Ramon family for 20 years, and had him at the house within the hour. Dr. Nolan examined her, treated a minor head wound, confirmed no fractures, and delivered his verdict. "She'll wake by morning," he said. "But Santiago, given the impact, there may be some temporary confusion." "What kind of confusion?" "Memory disruption. It's common with head trauma of this kind. Could be hours, could be longer." He paused. "She may not remember where she was, or what she was doing. She may not even remember who she is." Santiago sat with that information in silence. And he said nothing. Because at that moment, standing in the quiet of his own house, with the rain still falling outside, he understood exactly what it would mean if she woke up and did not remember. She would not remember the wedding. She would not remember running. She would not remember why she was afraid of him. But Santiago didn't know yet what kind of man that decision would reveal him to be. When she opened her eyes the next morning, she looked directly at him and asked the one question he had never in his life been asked. "Who are you?" She woke to pale light through heavy curtains and a ceiling she did not recognize. She lay very still for a long moment, examining the room. Stone walls, oak furniture, dark and old, a window with small panes of glass, a chair pulled close to the bed where a man was sitting, asleep, still wearing the collar and jacket of what appeared to be a formal suit. She sat up, slowly. Her head hurt. She touched her temple and found a clean white bandage that someone had applied carefully. She looked down at herself. She was wearing what appeared to be a white silk dress, now dry but badly creased, with a hem that had been cleaned of whatever it had been stained with. She did not recognize the dress. She looked at the man in the chair. He was awake now, had woken at the sound of her moving. He was watching her with an expression she could not read. Dark eyes, a composed, still face that gave away almost nothing. His hair was slightly disordered from sleeping in the chair, which seemed at odds with the formality of his clothes. She studied him for a moment. She reached for something, anything in her memory. A room, a street, a name, a face, a feeling, a fact. There was nothing. Not blankness, exactly. More like trying to read a page that had been soaked in water. There were shapes there, impressions of shapes, but nothing that resolved into meaning. She looked at the man again. "Who are you?" she asked. Something moved behind his eyes, something she couldn't name and that passed too quickly. "Santiago Ramon," he said. "This is my house." "How did I get here?" "I found you on the road," he said. "Last night. You'd been in an accident." A pause. "I brought you here because the conditions were poor and the hospital was far. My doctor has seen to you. You have a mild concussion and some bruising, but nothing serious." She pressed 2 fingers against the bandage at her temple and thought about this. What was I doing on the road? "I don't know," he said. And that was the first lie. She waited for more, some additional piece of information that would unlock the fog in her mind. Nothing came. "I don't remember," she finally said. Not an accusation, just a statement of fact, delivered quietly, the way a person announces something they are still processing. He nodded slowly. "The doctor said you might not, for a while." "I don't remember my name." A pause. "Do you know my name?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment, and in that moment, something happened inside Santiago Ramon that he would not be able to explain later. A kind of fracture in the clean, practical reasoning he had arranged around himself. He could tell her, right now. He could say her name, give her back her history, send her to her family, close the chapter cleanly. He didn't. "No," he said. "You had nothing with you. No identification." She accepted this. She looked around the room again, searching its quiet surfaces for something familiar. "Then what do I call myself?" He said the first name that came to mind. Simple, neutral, nothing connected to her real identity. "Anna," he said. "For now." She repeated it quietly, as if testing the weight of it. What Jianna Ross did not know, and had no way of knowing, was that the man sitting across from her already knew exactly who she was. The question was not whether she would ever find out. The question was what would happen to both of them before she did. The strange thing was, the woman who called herself Anna was nothing like the woman he thought he'd lost. Not even a little. By the second day, she was walking. Not far, and not fast. Her head still ached, and her ribs were bruised on one side from the fall. But she was unwilling to stay in the room. Santiago had offered it in a tone that made it clear she was welcome to remain in bed as long as she needed. She thanked him and got up anyway. The estate was larger than she had realized from the window. The house itself was old, maybe 300 years old in its bones, though parts of it had been rebuilt and reworked in different eras, so that the architecture was a kind of conversation between centuries. High ceilings, wide stone fireplaces, passages that turned unexpectedly, a grand staircase that led to a gallery hung with portraits of people who all had the same particular set of the jaw. She walked slowly through it, touching things occasionally. The wood of a banister, the edge of a window frame. She was testing everything like a person who has just learned the world is solid and wants to verify it. The staff, of whom there were 3, a housekeeper named Mrs. Graves, a groundskeeper named Thomas, and a young woman called Petra, who managed most of the kitchen, had been told only that a guest was recovering from an accident and needed rest and privacy. They were kind, in the efficient, undemonstrative way of people who have worked long enough in a place to feel responsible for it. Mrs. Graves, on the second morning, brought her a cup of tea and a change of clothes. Simple things, practical, borrowed from somewhere, and asked if she needed anything. "I'd like to see the grounds," she said. Mrs. Graves looked briefly uncertain, then said she'd have Thomas show her the path that was easy underfoot. But Santiago appeared in the corridor as she was putting on her coat and said, without particular emphasis, "I'll take you." She looked at him. He seemed to realize he had offered this a little too directly and added, "If that's suitable." "It's suitable," she said. They walked along the edge of the east garden, a formal arrangement of hedges and stone paths, slightly overgrown at the edges, which gave it the feeling of a place that was cared for, but not controlled. Beyond it lay the orchard, rows of old apple and pear trees, gnarled and broad, the grass beneath them still wet from the previous night's rain. She stopped under one of the apple trees and looked up through its branches. "How old are these?" she asked. "The oldest ones are about 120 years, he said. "My great-grandfather planted them." "And you've kept them?" "They produce well." She looked at him sideways. That's a very unsentimental answer for a man who clearly likes them. He said nothing for a moment. "What makes you think I like them?" She gestured at the ground. "The grass is cut between every row. The support stakes on the young ones at the end are new. You replaced them recently. And there's a bench over there." She pointed to a simple wooden bench set against the old stone wall at the orchard's edge. "It's the only one on this side of the house. Someone put it there to sit and look at this specific view." He was quiet for a moment. "My mother used to sit there," he said. She nodded and said nothing else, which was the correct thing to do, and which he noticed. They walked back in a silence that was, for reasons he could not immediately explain, entirely comfortable. That evening he found her in the library. She was cross-legged in the window seat with a book open on her knees, the late sun coming through the glass and making her hair warm. She looked completely at ease, not like someone adrift without a past, but like someone who had finally arrived somewhere she recognized. He stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking. She looked up. "This is a very good library," she said. "Thank you." "You've hidden the poetry." He stilled. "Behind the law volumes," she continued, gesturing. "Third shelf from the top on the left. The spines are newer, but you've put them in the middle of the dull ones, which is suspicious." She paused. "I wasn't snooping. I was just looking for something to read." For the first time in years, someone had seen inside a room he had closed off to everyone. And the strange, unsettling truth was, he didn't mind. But Santiago didn't know yet that his silence was building something he would not be able to dismantle. By the end of the first week, a routine had settled between them. Not by design, neither of them arranged it, but patterns emerged the way they do when two people occupy the same space honestly. She was early to the kitchen in the morning, he was late. She read in the library after lunch while he worked, and they fell into the habit of sharing the space in silence. In the late afternoon, she walked, and occasionally, without discussion, he joined her. She was not what he had expected, the woman he had agreed to marry, the Jianna Ross he had known through business dinners and family visits, had been polished and contained. Intelligent, certainly, but guarded in a way that made conversation feel like negotiation. She had never asked him anything he didn't expect. She had never surprised him. Anna surprised him constantly. "Why do your staff address you as though they're slightly afraid of you?" she asked on the third day, at breakfast, with no particular tone, just genuine inquiry. He looked up from his newspaper. "They aren't afraid of me." "Mrs. Graves checks the set of your jaw before she says good morning," she said pleasantly. That's either fear or extremely close observation. Either way, it's interesting. He put the newspaper down. Mrs. Graves has worked here for 18 years, which means she knows you well and still checks your jaw. What does that tell you? He opened his mouth and then closed it because he had no immediate answer to that. She poured her tea and smiled at her cup. Later that same week, she found him in the study reviewing documents and sat across from him without being invited. He did not ask her to leave. She picked up a book from the corner of his desk, a collected volume on architecture, and began reading it. And for an hour, they shared the room in silence that was full of something, but not uncomfortable. She looked up eventually and caught him watching her. "Why do you look at me like you're trying to solve a puzzle?" she asked. He held her gaze. "Do I?" "Consistently," she said. "Ever since I woke up." She set the book down. "I don't mind. I'm just curious." "You remind me of someone," he said, which was technically true. She considered this. "Someone you were close to?" "Someone I thought I knew," he said. She watched him for a moment with that direct, unhurried quality she had, the way she looked at things until she understood them. It was the most unsettling thing about her. She did not look away. "You must miss them," she said. "I'm not sure," he said. "I'm not sure I ever knew them well enough to miss them properly." She nodded slowly, as though this made a kind of sense she recognized. "That's a sad thing," she said. Not with pity, just with clarity. He said nothing. One afternoon, he came upon her at the far end of the east garden, crouched in front of a gap in the hedge where a stray dog, a lean, mud-colored thing with an apologetic expression, had pushed through from the lane. She had broken a piece of bread from her pocket and was offering it in her palm. The dog took it carefully. "He's been here 3 mornings in a row," she said without looking up. "I know," he said. She looked up then. "You feed him?" He said nothing. "Thomas told me," she said. "He said you leave something out by the gate every morning before 7. She studied his face. "And then you let people believe you barely notice the animal exists." The dog pushed its head against her hand. "Why do you hide it?" she asked. He looked away from her and toward the gap in the hedge. "Some things don't need an audience," he said. What he didn't say, what he was only beginning to understand himself, was that the version of him she was seeing was not the version anyone else had seen in a very long time, and he had no idea what to do with that. That night, Santiago realized something that unsettled him deeply. The woman he had been required to marry was becoming the woman he actually wanted. Into the second week, she began to wake without headaches. The bruising along her ribs faded from purple to green to yellow. She moved more freely, walked farther, stayed up later. Dr. Nolan visited and declared himself satisfied with the physical recovery. Memory, he reminded them both, was its own timeline and could not be rushed. She seemed to accept this with a kind of equanimity that Santiago found remarkable. He had expected distress, panic at the blankness, at the missing years, at the not knowing. But she met it differently. "I think," she told him one evening, "that I must have been a reasonably calm person, because this doesn't frighten me as much as it seems like it should." "Perhaps you're in shock," he said carefully. She shook her head. "Shock doesn't feel like this. This feels like..." She looked for the word. "Like standing in a room that someone just emptied. There's space, but it's familiar space. The shape of the room is still yours." He thought about that for a long time afterward. One afternoon in the middle of the second week, Thomas brought 2 horses out for exercise. Anna appeared at the stable door in borrowed riding clothes, with an expression that said she was not sure if she could ride, but intended to find out. She could ride. She rode well, easily, naturally, her body remembering what her mind had lost. She took the gray mare along the path through the lower meadow, and Santiago rode alongside her, and for a long stretch neither of them spoke, and the silence was one of the most pleasant things he had experienced in recent memory. "I think I must have ridden often," she said. "Your seat is good," he agreed. "Did your—" She stopped. "Is there someone here who rides regularly, other than you?" "No," he said. She nodded and asked no more. That evening, after dinner, they sat in the library by the fire. This had become common, not something either of them had arranged, but something that had simply become where they both were at that hour. She had developed the habit of reading with her feet tucked up on the window seat. He worked at the desk. But tonight she set her book aside and said, "Tell me something about yourself that you don't usually tell people." He looked over. "That's a direct question." "I find direct questions work better," she said. "Indirect questions allow people to answer something adjacent to what you asked, and then you never know anything." He was quiet for a moment. "I wanted to be an architect," he said, "when I was young, before the family business made other decisions." She was watching him carefully. "The architecture books," she said. "The architecture books," he confirmed. "What kind of things did you want to build?" "Houses that people would want to live in," he said. "Not estates, not developments. Just houses that fit the people inside them, instead of asking the people to fit themselves to the house." The fire moved. She looked at him with something in her eyes that he could not name, and that he found he very much did not want to look away from. "You would have been good at that," she said. "You don't know that." "No," she agreed, "but I know you notice how things fit and how they don't. You noticed me looking at the orchard and understood what I saw. People who notice things like that are usually good at building them." She paused. The family business must have been a significant loss. The accuracy of it caught him somewhere he hadn't expected to be caught. "I don't talk about it," he said. "No," she said. "I don't imagine you do." He crossed the room and sat in the chair across from her, nearer to the fire. They talked for 2 more hours. About nothing particular. About everything. When she finally said goodnight and took her book upstairs, Santiago sat alone by the cooling fire and understood, with the clarity of something that had been true for a while and had only just been said aloud inside him, that he was in very serious trouble. The problem was simple. She had fallen for the man she thought had saved her, not the man she once ran away from. And Santiago knew, no matter how much he wanted to pretend otherwise, that those were the same man. It rained for 3 days at the start of the 3rd week, the kind of rain that makes an old stone house feel like the only warm place in the world. She read and he worked, and they moved through the rooms of the house in the easy orbit of people who have stopped being strangers. Mrs. Graves noticed. She said nothing, because she had been a housekeeper for enough years to know that the job required noticing without commenting. But she began setting 2 cups at the library fire without being asked, and she stopped suggesting that their guest might prefer her meals taken upstairs. On the second rainy afternoon, Anna came into the study, where he was working, and set a plate of something on the corner of his desk. "Mrs. Graves made biscuits," she said. "She said you don't eat enough during the day." He looked at the plate. "She says that every day. Apparently, it's worth repeating." She sat down in the chair across from him. "Can I ask you something?" "You usually do," he said. She smiled at that, briefly, and something in his chest moved. "Do you have family?" she asked. "People who come here?" He set his pen down. "My parents died some years ago. I have a younger sister, Cecily. She visits occasionally. She lives in the city." "Do you get along?" "She thinks I'm too serious. I think she's reckless. We agree on most things that matter." Anna nodded. "Does she know about me?" A pause. I told her a guest was recovering from an accident and was staying here for a while. She accepted that. Is she curious? Cecily is always curious about everything. It's her most exhausting quality. He paused. And her best. She smiled again. You sound like you love her very much while barely tolerating her. That covers it adequately. She laughed. The full, unguarded laugh that she gave sometimes. The one that seemed to surprise even her. And he looked at his desk, because looking at her while she laughed had recently become something he could not do without his composure slipping in ways he found inconvenient. The rain stopped on the third day. Late afternoon, the clouds cleared, and the wet garden turned gold in the sudden sun. She appeared at the back door in the coat she had started treating as her own, and looked out at the light on the wet grass. Walk, she said. He didn't answer. He simply got his own coat. They went along the lake path. The ground was soft, and the air smelled of wet leaves and stone. The lake was perfectly still, mirroring the gold of the sky, broken occasionally at the edges by ducks who had clearly ridden out the rain without complaint. They walked without speaking, which was now as natural as speaking. At the end of the lake path, there was a small stone bridge over the stream where it flowed out of the lake's far end. She stopped there and leaned against the rail, looking down at the running water. He stood beside her. The light was low and warm, and the whole world was very quiet. She turned to look at him and found him already looking at her. She reached up, slowly, with a kind of deliberateness that made it impossible to misunderstand what she meant, and touched the side of his face. He did not move. She kissed him. It was gentle, unhurried, the kind of kiss that does not rush toward anything, but exists completely in its own moment. He kissed her back. And then he stopped. He stepped back. Not dramatically, not with the kind of abrupt motion that would have felt like rejection, but with a careful, terrible restraint that she felt as a kind of cold after the warmth. She looked at him. Santiago. I'm sorry, he said. Don't apologize. This isn't... He stopped. Something moved across his face. Not coldness, the opposite of coldness. Something controlled, something held in with great effort. This isn't straightforward, he said finally. She looked at him steadily. Why? He couldn't tell her. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Some things are more complicated than they appear, he said. And that was when she understood, for the first time, that Santiago Ramon was keeping something from her. She didn't know what it was yet, but the problem, it would turn out, was far worse than either of them had imagined. Sleep came harder after the kiss. She lay in the dark, listening to the old house settle, and thought about the look on his face. Not the kiss itself, but the moment after. The careful withdrawal. The words that sounded measured when she suspected they had cost him something. This isn't straightforward. There was something he knew. She had felt it for days, not suspicion exactly, but a kind of quiet pressure at the edges of her awareness. The way he sometimes stopped mid-sentence. The way he watched her with that expression of mixed longing and restraint, as though he was looking at something he both wanted and felt he had no right to. She fell asleep eventually, and the dreams began. The first one was more a feeling than an image. Candles, many candles, and the smell of something sweet and heavy. Voices, a murmur of expectation from a room full of people. She stood somewhere elevated, looking down, and felt the tight, compressed sensation of something inescapable. She woke and lay still in the dark until her heartbeat slowed. Over the following days, the fragments came in irregular bursts, pieces, not stories. A church, white stone walls, a very high ceiling crossed with wooden beams, bell towers visible through a tall window. Then, her father's face, hard set, certain. The look he gave her when a matter was decided and dissent was merely a delay. Then, flowers, ivory flowers in her hands, a bridal bouquet, held so tightly the stems were bending. Then, an altar, a man standing at an altar. She sat up in bed the night that image came and pressed both hands against her face and tried to hold on to it. The image was blurry, imprecise. She could not make out the man's features, could not read his expression. He was simply a figure in dark, formal clothing at the far end of an aisle. She told herself it was a dream. She told herself it was symbolic, the kind of image the subconscious uses to work through abstract fears. But she knew, somewhere below the rationalizing, that it was not a dream. She mentioned none of this to Santiago. She did not know why exactly. Perhaps because the images came with a feeling of dread attached to them, a cold heaviness that she could not explain, and she was not yet ready to examine what that meant. He noticed the change in her. Of course he did. He noticed everything. One morning over breakfast, he looked at her carefully and said, "You didn't sleep well." "No." "Dreams?" She looked at her cup. "Fragments," she said. "Not enough to hold on to." He said nothing, but the careful quality of his silence told her the word fragments had landed somewhere particular for him. That evening she was in the library when it happened. She was not trying to remember. She was reading, or trying to, and the fire was low and the house was quiet, and she had almost drifted toward sleep in the window seat when it arrived. Not a fragment, a sequence. A morning. A dress being fitted. Her mother's voice. Her father at the telephone. Her own face in a long mirror, looking at the reflection of a bride who did not recognize herself. Then the reception. The hall, filled with people, music, light. Her chest tightening as the evening went on. The sense of walls closing in. Of something being sealed that she needed to stop before it sealed. And then, running. Rain. The dark. A road. Headlights. She stood up. The book fell to the floor and she stood in the middle of the library with both hands pressed against her sternum, breathing as though she had been running. She stood there for a long time. And then the final piece arrived, the one she had been circling for days. The face at the altar. She knew the face at the altar. And that was when the memory returned. All of it, in one sudden, devastating flood. She found him in the study. He was at his desk. When he looked up and saw her face, he was very still for a moment. And then he stood. She stopped in the middle of the room. "My name," she said, "is Jianna Ross." He said nothing. "I was getting married," she said, 3 weeks ago, in a hall not far from here." She watched his face. I ran from the wedding, and I was on the road, and there was an accident." She paused. "The man I was supposed to marry..." She stopped. The words arranged themselves in her mind with a terrible clarity. "It was you." Silence. "It was you," she said again, not louder, but harder. "You are the groom I left standing at the altar." He held her gaze. "Yes," he said. The words settled in the room like a stone dropped in still water. She stood with it for a moment. "You knew," she said. "From the beginning, When I woke up, you knew who I was." "Yes." "And you said nothing." "No." She turned away from him and faced the fireplace. Her hands were completely still at her sides, which told him more about what this cost her than any other gesture might have. "Why?" she said. Quiet. Not angry. Not yet. Genuinely asking. He came around the desk. He stood a few feet behind her. "When I found you on the road," he said, "I knew immediately. And then you woke up, and you didn't know me, and I—" He stopped, found the honest version of it. "I told myself it was practical, that you needed to recover before you could manage the truth. I told myself it was kinder." She turned to face him. "And now?" "Now I think I did it because the woman without memories was the only version of you who had ever wanted to be near me." The silence after that was very long. She looked at him, really looked at him, with all the months of knowing him and not knowing him at once. The man who fed stray dogs, the man who hid poetry behind law books, the man who had sat up through her first night of injury in a chair beside her bed, the man she had kissed on the bridge. "I ran," she said, "because I believed you were incapable of love, because I believed this was a transaction and not a marriage." "I know. I was afraid of spending my life with someone who couldn't see me." "I know that too," he said, "and you were right to be afraid of the man I was." She looked at him. "Tell me honestly," she said, "the man you were, did he care anything about me?" "The man I was," he said, "was too proud to admit that he had been watching you cross a room for 14 months, too controlled to let himself understand what that meant." He was very still. "I thought feeling something strongly was a weakness. I thought I could manage it. I thought the arrangement and the feeling were separate things." "They aren't separate." "No," he said, "they aren't." She pressed 2 fingers against her mouth, thinking. "I don't know what to do with this," she said. "You don't have to do anything with it," he said. "Not now. Not if you don't want to." A pause. "I won't ask you to stay." She looked at him once more, a long, searching look that he met without flinching. Then she walked past him, down the hall, up the stairs, to the guest room that had been hers for 3 weeks. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, and she understood, with the kind of certainty that lives below thought, that she did not know how to leave. But she also did not know how to stay. Santiago thought he was prepared for what came next. He was wrong. She left 4 days later. Not immediately. Not in the heat of the revelation, not with bags flung together and a door slammed. She was too honest for that. She took 4 days to think, and during those 4 days, the house was full of a silence that was completely different from all the other silences that had lived in it since she arrived. The easy silences were gone. These new silences were like pressure. They passed each other in corridors and at mealtimes with a careful courtesy that felt like a foreign language after the naturalness they'd had. She still sat in the library, but now the door was open. He still brought his work to the desk, but now there was a quality of effort in the stillness that had previously been effortless. She was kind to him. That was, in some ways, the hardest part. She did not rage, she did not punish. She treated him with the particular consideration of someone who understands that another person is suffering and chooses not to add to it, even when their own suffering is partly caused by that person's choices. On the morning of the 4th day, she came to find him. He was in the orchard, standing under the oldest apple tree, for no reason that he could have easily named. She came through the gate from the garden and walked toward him, and he turned when he heard her footsteps on the wet grass. She was wearing her coat, the one that had started as borrowed. She had a bag with her. His chest did not move. "I need to go," she said. "Not because I don't—" She stopped. "Not because nothing here was real. All of it was real." Her eyes were clear, even now. "But I need to find out who I am when I'm standing in my own life, not in yours. I've been living in the shape of someone else's days." "I understand," he said. "I don't think you should have kept the truth from me," she said. "I know. I think you were afraid." She looked at him. "And I understand being afraid." He said nothing because there was nothing true and helpful that he could say. "I don't know what I would have done," she added quietly, "if you'd told me who you were when I woke up. Maybe I would have left immediately. Maybe what happened between us would never have happened." She tilted her head slightly. "I can't be grateful for the lie, but I also can't pretend the last 3 weeks weren't—" She stopped. He waited. "The last 3 weeks were the most honest I've ever felt in my life," she said. "And that's the hardest part." She held out her hand. He looked at it for a moment, then took it. She held his hand the way she had that first day at the lake, properly, warmly, with the quiet completeness of someone who is not holding back. Then she let go. She walked back through the orchard gate, across the garden, and around the side of the house where the car she had arranged was waiting. He stood under the apple tree. He listened to the car door, the engine, the sound diminishing down the drive. When the silence became complete, he sat down on the bench his mother had used to sit on and looked at the orchard that had always been here and understood something he had not understood before. He had spent his entire life managing the distance between himself and everything he wanted, and he had finally managed it perfectly. Thousands of miles away, in a town by the sea, a woman was learning to be herself again, and the realization she arrived at would change everything. The estate was very quiet after she left. It had been quiet before, of course. It was always quiet. Santiago had lived alone in it for years and considered the quiet a feature, not a deficiency. He had organized his life around it. He worked in it, ate in it, slept in it. But this was different. This was the specific quiet of rooms that remember noise. He noticed things he hadn't noticed before she arrived, and now could not stop noticing. The window seat in the library held the slight depression from weeks of being sat in. There was a bookmark left behind in the architecture book, a strip torn from the corner of a page, which he recognized as a habit she had apologized for and then continued anyway. 2 cups were still set at the library fire each evening because Mrs. Graves had not yet adjusted. He worked. He worked the way he always had, diligently, precisely, long hours, and found that it no longer felt like discipline. It felt like filling time. 3 weeks after she left, Cecily came to visit. His sister was 28 and had the particular quality of someone who had decided at a young age to experience everything directly rather than let it happen at a managed remove. She was dark-haired like him and moved through rooms with the confidence of someone who has no patience for the slow parts. She arrived unannounced, as she always did. She let herself in through the kitchen, greeted Mrs. Graves by name, accepted a piece of bread and cheese, and found Santiago in the study. She stood in the doorway and looked at him for a moment. "You look terrible," she said, with the gentle concern of someone who leads with truth. "Thank you. I heard about the wedding. I assumed you would." She sat down across from him, pulling her feet up under her. "Tell me what happened. The real version." He told her. Not the version he had given the family or the business contacts, not the edited account that made things clean and final. The real version. All of it. Cecily listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her, and which told him she understood the weight of it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. You knew it was her from the moment you found her, she said. Yes. And you let her live here for 3 weeks without telling her. Yes. Cecily looked at him steadily. Why? She said. And then immediately, no, I know why. Because the version of her without the history was the first version of her you felt free with. He said nothing. And now you're sitting in this house, she said, and you're miserable, and you've convinced yourself that you don't deserve to do anything about it. She left. You let her leave, Cecily said. There's a difference. You didn't ask her to stay. Did you tell her you love her? Silence. Santiago. It wasn't the moment. It is never the moment for you, she said, not unkindly. It is never the right time, the right circumstance, the right arrangement. You have been waiting your entire life for the moment when love was perfectly organized, and you are going to spend the rest of your life in this house waiting for that moment, and it is never going to come. The fire moved. He looked at the chair she used to sit in. She had every reason to leave, he said. She did, Cecily agreed. But she also had 3 weeks of reasons to stay. He was quiet for a long time. She's in a coastal town, he said. I had someone find her address to make sure she arrived safely. Cecily looked at him. Santiago, I wasn't going to do anything with it, but you have it. He said nothing. She ran away from a man who was never honest about who he was, Cecily said quietly. She deserves the chance to choose the man who is. He looked at his sister, and for the first time in months, he felt something shift in him. Something that had been locked for a very long time, quietly, carefully, finally unlocking. He had one chance left, and this time, he would not manage it from a distance. The town of Caro-on-Sea sat at the edge of a low coastal cliff, which meant that on clear mornings, the sea was visible from almost every street in it, a wide blue line at the end of things that changed color with the weather and the time. She had chosen it because she did not know it. This was important. Every other place she might have gone carried the weight of her former life, her father's expectations, her mother's careful arrangements, the social geography of a world in which she had been a specific kind of person with specific kinds of obligations. Here, she was no one in particular. That was the point. She had found a room above a small bookshop on the main street, and the woman who owned the shop, a forthright and unsentimental woman named Dorothea, had asked after 2 weeks whether she wanted to work. She said yes. The work suited her. Books came in and went out. People came in looking for something specific, and sometimes she found it for them, and sometimes she found something better. She learned the irregular rhythms of a small shop in a quiet town. The school children after 3, the pensioners on rainy mornings, the summer visitors who hadn't yet started arriving, but whose absence she could feel like a held breath in the town's low-season quiet. She was healing, not from the accident, that was long since done, from everything else. She thought about Santiago. Of course she did. She thought about him the way you think about a place you have loved and left, with the specific texture of it, the specific light of it, the understanding of how particular it was to that place and that time and that version of yourself. She did not allow herself to wonder too much whether she had been right to leave. She had been right to leave. She knew this. She needed to be herself outside of his house before she could understand what she actually wanted. She was figuring that out. It was a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after she'd arrived in the town, when she was arranging a delivery of new stock near the front window of the shop and saw a familiar figure on the street. She went still. He was looking at the bookshop window with the focused attention of someone reading every title in the display. He was in his ordinary clothes, not formal, nothing like the groom she half remembered from the altar. Just a dark coat, standing with his hands in his pockets, slightly at a loss. She watched him for a moment. Then she went to the door and opened it. He looked up. The silence between them on the pavement carried everything that had not yet been said. "I didn't know which bookshop," he said, finally. "I had to try 4. "This is the only one in town," she said. "I know that now." He looked at her steadily. "I came to say something. I'm not going to ask you to decide anything today or do anything with it. I just need to say it." She stepped out of the doorway and closed the shop door behind her. He looked at her for a long moment, as though he was organizing something carefully. Then he said, "I loved you before the wedding. I am not sure I understood that clearly enough to act on it, but it was true. And the man who stood at that altar and watched you choose yourself over a transaction, I think some part of him was proud of you, even as he drove too fast through the rain." She was very still. "I kept the truth from you, and I would not do that again. There are no versions of you I want to manage or protect you from. Not the one with memories, not the one without, not the one who ran, and not the one who stayed. All of them were real." He paused. "All of them, I think, were always her." She looked at him. "You drove to 4 bookshops," she said. "I drove to 4 bookshops. Cecily sent you," she said. It wasn't a question. "Cecily informed me," he said, "that I had a habit of making things complicated that weren't." She wasn't wrong. She breathed. The sea was visible at the end of the street, blue-gray and wide. "There was no arrangement this time," he said. "No families, no contracts, no agreements made over dinner between 2 men who forgot to consult the people most directly affected." A pause. "I'm here because I want to be. And if you tell me to go away, I will go away. But if there's any chance you would consider—" "Santiago," she said. "Spending more time with Santiago." He stopped. He was smiling, not a polite smile, not a careful one. The real one, the full, unguarded one he had first seen in the library, the one that seemed to surprise even her. "I've been thinking about you since I left," she said. "Every day. Not about the lie, about you." She tilted her head. The orchard, the dogs, the poetry behind the law books. He watched her. "I was waiting," she said quietly, "to see if you would come. Because I needed to know if you were the man I thought you were." She looked at him with clear, steady eyes. "You came to 4 bookshops." "I did." "Then I think I have my answer," she said. He did not rush toward her. He did not move dramatically. He simply took 1 step forward, and she took 1 step forward, and they met in the middle, the way things do when they have been gravitating toward each other for long enough. He held her face in both hands, the way a person holds something they had thought they had lost permanently and finds, somehow, returned. She held on. On the street of a small coastal town, with the sea at the end of it and the bookshop door behind her, Jianna Ross made the only choice in this whole story that was entirely, freely, and irrevocably hers. She chose him. Not because her father had arranged it, not because contracts demanded it, not because she had woken in his house without a name and built a life in his rooms and fallen into it without fully knowing, but because she had left and learned who she was without him and found that he was still there, still true, and still worth the return. She chose him with everything she remembered and everything she had discovered and every version of herself that had ever stood at the edge of something and decided whether to run or to stay. This time, she stayed. "Will you choose me?" he had asked. "Not because you have to, but because you want to?" She looked at him on that pavement, on that Thursday morning, with the gray-blue sea behind them. "I already did." And that was where their real story began. If you stayed until the end, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who knows what it costs to love someone you once had every reason to leave. Until next time, the next story is already waiting for you.